My name is Martin Clunan. I am the director of the Turku Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Turku and sometime popular music scholar. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome my distinguished colleague and friend Simon Frith here this evening. I'm delighted to see him in Turku. Simon is currently Emeritus Professor of Music at the University of Edinburgh, having previously held positions at Stirling, Strathclyde and Warwick in the UK. He's also the author of several seminal books, including The Sociology of Rock, first published in 1978, Sound Effects from 1983, Performing Rites 1996. Then I'm going to give you the sort of highlights of his other co-authored and edited books, which include Art into Pop, On Record, Music and Copyright, and the Cambridge Companion to Pop and Rock. I think he's also one of the few popular music scholars to be translated into Finnish. A couple of his books were translated into Finnish, and he's certainly the only one popular music scholar that I know that has had a book published about his work, which was Popular Music Matters, published in 2014, the same year that Simon had a 3-day conference held in his honour about his work. In an article I wrote a couple of years ago, I compared Simon's influence in popular music studies to that of Marx in the social science. He's such a kind of seminal figure that you have to engage with his work, whether you like it or not. I'm kind of ambivalent, and no. I actually, of course, really like his work, and it's a real pleasure to welcome Simon here today. There's a couple. Still some seats at the front, if people. Yeah. Simon, I think this is your first visit to Turku.
I think so, because I can't remember it. So if I hadn't been here, I definitely would remember having been here.
Have you been to Finland much before? What have your impressions been when you have been here?
Well, I've been quite often, particularly to Tampere and Helsinki. I originally came because I was researching the European music industry. And Finland was one of the pioneers of getting the state to invest in music through, I think it was called Finnish Music Export. And there was a guy, whose name was Jari Mwiku, who was in charge of that. And so I came over here originally to interview him about that project. And of course, I'm not sure if it was exactly the first, but it was certainly the first I knew in Britain as being very efficient. And it was soon imitated by other Scandinavian countries, by Iceland, and most interestingly in some ways, by France. And so for me, Finland was always a very interesting place in the kind of context of European popular music culture. And coming here, I just found it a great atmosphere. And everybody told me that Finns were silent. I can never think it's the most stupid thing. I've always found Finns incredibly talkative.
Well, we'll find out that.
Only be in terms of popular music culture.
Right, yeah. We might find out that later when I throw it open to the audience for questions later. I'd like to ask you about the first thing you wrote about popular music. I've asked you about this before, and you had quite a good story about the first thing you'd ever written for a student magazine, and I'd like you to share that with us today. I
went to Oxford University and they had a magazine called ISIS. They didn't really cover popular music, they covered jazz. And I wanted to persuade them to cover popular music, or at least I wanted to write about popular music. And I originally posited them that I would write about the relationship between jazz and popular music. But before I did that, I did do some stuff on that. I got very interested because I was a rather odd pop fan in Andrew Loog Oldham, who was the manager of the Rolling Stones. And he was a kind of mysterious figure who was never interviewed. So I thought I might be able to persuade him to be interviewed by me coming from a prestigious university student paper and talking to him rather than talking to the Rolling Stones. So I got in touch with his office. I can't remember how I did it. But eventually I got a message back saying he would talk to me, telling me where his office was. And I went up to his office, arrived in this very nice, modern, plush building, taken up in the lift, sat in this waiting room, sort of a room not unlike this, and then nothing happened for 10 minutes. And then eventually two people who looked very familiar came in and sat down, and I assumed they were waiting like I was. So still nothing happened for a few more minutes. Then one of them said very aggressively, "And you're going to talk to us then?" And I then realised it was Mick Jagger. And I said, no, I didn't come here to talk to you. I came here to talk to Andrew. And they said, well, Andrew Logan didn't give an interview, so you have to interview us. So my first interview was an extremely both embarrassing and hostile encounter, but I did find it fun. So that's how I started.
So it took you 10 minutes to recognise Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, did it?
Well, I wasn't expecting them. and they weren't on their, like all pop stars, they weren't in their stage clothes and they weren't as big as they looked on television. And they were kind of scruffy, but then I kind of was expecting that in one way. But no, I mean, I was being, if I'd been thinking at all, but I was incredibly nervous. And I just thought they were probably bodyguards for Andrew Golden.
And then was the second group you interviewed the animals, and their accents, the Newcastle accents were so thick you couldn't understand to your questions anyways.
The things I did on jazz was an interview with Manfred Mann, who was South African, but he was a very well-spoken, nice-mannered man. And I interviewed him in his house in Barnes, which is quite an upmarket part of London. Very, very good, very interesting. And I then arranged to interview the animals, who had, some of them at least had a very straightforward jazz background. Eric Burdon started as a jazz singer. And they arranged to meet in a very small drinking club in London, which was quite noisy. And they have very broad Geordie accents, which is a Newcastle accent, and I could not understand a single word they said, especially when they all talked at once. So that was, again, an interesting experience of how to prepare for an interview. You have to learn Geordie in that case.
So not recognising the Rolling Stones and then not understanding the animals. Not the most auspicious start to your career. But
that's when I realised I had to be an academic.
I think one of the many distinctive things about your career is that you've mixed serious journalism in some of the leading journals and newspapers with academic writing. And here I have a couple of questions. What do you think are the most important differences between journalistic writing and academic writing? And which one do you enjoy most?
To take the first one first, the most important difference between journalism writing and academic writing is that journalism writing matters a very great deal for a very, very short period of time. So on the day it comes out, it's kind of significant. But within 24 hours, everybody's completely forgotten it, including yourself. And so it means that you learn not to take what you write very seriously. It's not for posterity. I mean, in a different interview, I could go through the number of stupid things I've said in newspaper articles. Or, famously for me is when I reviewed Johnny Thunders playing in Manchester, and the support act was a band which I'd read a few things about but didn't know much about, called the Smiths. And in my review, I said, one thing is certain, is the Smiths will never make it. Now, of course, I wrote that, but nobody remembers I wrote that. It's completely vanished into the newspaper archive in a place like this. So I think that was the most important thing, is that you get used to the fact that your writing doesn't really matter. But it's read by a lot of people who may or may not have any interest in it. Whereas academic writing, you are writing in a sense to have your books on shelves like they are here, and that people, you want to feel that in 10 years' time, someone studying the subject will still think what you wrote is worth reading. So it's a very different thinking about it. The other thing, interestingly, which is kind of opposite of what you might expect, particularly when I started writing for American magazines, American newspapers and magazines have what are called fact checkers, and they are depending on how much money they've got, they are absolutely rigorous in making sure that everything you say you can document and prove. So if you quote David Bowie saying something, you have to be able to tell the fact checker where he said it and how you can prove that he said it. In academic books, I discovered you could write anything and nobody seems to care. I mean, especially in popular music studies, because publishers just don't, academic publishers particularly, they'll send it out to peer review, but they have nobody who's sitting there saying, did that record really come out in 1972 or did it come out in 1971? Whereas in an American magazine, you have to be able to absolutely show it came out in 1971. So that was an interesting difference. I think I found much more respect for evidence in the press than I did in the cabinet.
And which the second question, which did you enjoy?
I enjoy writing very much, but I hate starting writing. As Martin knows to his bitterness, if he's involved in a joint writing project with me, I will be many years later than I said I would be. Whereas with a newspaper, you got many minutes later and you said you won't get published. So I learned to write to deadline, which is very bad for academic work because it means I leave it too late. But it's a really good experience of having to write even when you don't feel like anything else. And once I start writing, I love it. I don't know now. When I look back on my youth, I was a full-time academic. At one time I was writing a column a week for Melody Maker and a column every month for Village Voice and reviewing all the time. How I managed to do all that writing, I have no idea, but I think it's just because you have to do it, you just do it. Whereas the academy is not good at making people write when they don't feel like it.
I wanted to ask you something about the music press now. I mean, in the last month or so, the last weekly British print newspaper, the NME has closed, and possibly not before time. But I wondered what you thought was the influence of the music press on popular music studies.
I think the influence of the music press on popular music studies was immense when popular music studies started. Because in a sense, the first draft, people often say the first draft of history is written by war reports and so on. I think the first draft of popular music studies was written by popular music writers and press, because they did it first. And they established a kind of notion of who was worth writing about and why they were worth writing about. And it was in the music press that we learned that punk was the most important thing that ever happened to British music. And on the whole, popular music studies followed the account of popular music that the British music press provided, which I think has been to the detriment of popular music studies in some ways. I think it meant that for a very long time it was very dominated by a notion of rock as being the central part of popular music. Had a very skewed version of history, as if history of popular music started in 1956, when in Britain probably started in 1966. And I think, you'd think popular music scholars would have been the people who kind of challenged that, but in the early days of popular music studies, certainly I think that was the popular music press had dominated how the field was set up. And although I think that's now changed, particularly with people coming from kind of non-rock areas or non-rock interests, by and large I think popular music press, I mean I can only speak here for Britain and the US and certain other European countries. I have no idea about Finland, for example, but certainly in France, Germany, popular music writers were very influential in how popular music studies developed.
Moving into the academic world, you're probably best known there as being a pioneer of what became popular music studies. Your first book, The Sociology of Rock, was published in 1978 in, I guess, what we would now call the sort of beginning of the post-punk era. A very pioneering text in a lot of ways. But 40 years ago, what was the critical reaction to someone who's a sociologist working in a proper university writing about pop music, for God's sake?
Well, you have to put this in context, Lady. Again, this is you're talking in a little sense from a popular music studies perspective, which didn't really exist then. I wrote it because I was a sociologist, and I'm still a sociologist, and I wanted to show that sociologists could say interesting things about popular music. And I was also a pop and rock critic, and I wanted to show that an academic approach can reveal things that you critics are not interested in. So for me, the book was about showing that you could write sociology about A, about music, and B, about a certain aspect of popular culture. And within sociology, I think that was accepted. If you see what I mean? It was good enough sociology. It was very much in the time when media studies were starting and people were writing about popular television and film studies and all those things. So it was fitting into a kind of model of what became cultural studies, or exactly part of that, the sociological, sociocultural studies, rather than fitting into popular music studies, which although it didn't really get going until the 80s in an academic sense. So that was, so I think in academic terms, I think that was felt, I mean, there were people who thought sociology was a waste of time, let alone sociology culture. I think in the music press, this was just regarded as a lot of bloody intellectuals talking about our music. I don't think that changed as well, but I don't think at that time, partly because there was this romantic notion that rock was this wonderfully revolutionary thing, whether it was punk or whether it was the original Rolling Stones, that people really didn't want to write or report much about the music business, which is what I was most interested in. And again, that changed, but I mean, even to the end of its days, you would never have found that NME really give you any understanding at all of what was going on in the music industry.
So now, at least in the UK, we have numerous popular music degrees of various sorts. Who did you think you were writing for at the time you were writing sound effects? Who did you think would be interested, other than sociologists?
I thought anybody, I mean, again, I think there was a kind of what you might call the secular intellectual class, who were people who were interested in the sorts of things that academic sociologists were interested in but weren't academics. So people who were interested in thinking about youth culture or thinking about criminology about crime. So there's a certain kind of, there still existed a certain sort of serious press magazines about social issues. Like New Society would probably have been, which was a magazine that existed then, which was presenting for lay readers sociological accounts, but also using a lot of very good cultural journalists like say George Melly or whoever would be reporting on cultural activities. And I think I probably felt that I was writing for the people who read that, or for New Statesman, or for certain sorts of. And at the time, of course, I was also I always presented myself in school too as a Marxist, and there was a kind of enough of a Marxist intellectual class around. But partly what I wanted to do, to go back to you, was to get Marxists to take popular music seriously. So it was partly a kind of political intervention. So I thought that the people who would read me wouldn't really be academics in the sort of broad sense, except for sociologists. They wouldn't really be pop fans. You would be sort of what you might call cultural intellectuals. It was a kind of fantasy. It was kind of like, that's what I felt I was, so I thought there must be other people like me out there.
And I guess without delving too much into the murky waters of Marxism, I know at the time, that certainly the Communist Party in the...
This one was, I think.
You just need to hold it closer. Yeah.
Let's just switch.
Okay. Yeah, that's better.
Yes, so you said you wanted to get popular music taken seriously by Marxism. My recollection at the time that there were certain elements of the Communist Party, at least, sort of completely dismissed popular music and were very into more kind of folky things. And actually, it was the more kind of Trotskyist left that embraced popular music. Or have I got that wrong?
You got it wrong. Basically, well, I'm very prejudiced here, and this is more complicated. I'm going to say. The Communist Party, in its sort of inner sanctum, the British Communist Party, there was certainly a very strong tradition of being anti-American music, and of being anti-commercial music, and seeing folk music as central. But this was much more complicated than it sounds, because if you take sort of significant figures like you and Nicole, they were actually, he formed a skiffle band. They were very into jazz and blues of a certain sort, and they were a significant part of kind of what you might broadly call rock and roll culture in the 50s. And the Communist Party always had people in it that were interested in popular music. They were very big in jazz, for example. A lot of jazz musicians were members of the Communist Party. And what I found was that the Communist Party was the best place to have debates about things. So you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the more fun events I can remember going to is when the young communists, there used to be a thing called Communist University of London, where every year the Communist Party had sort of intellectual debates. And there was a debate on whether young communists would be allowed to have discos at their events. And I can still remember, and they asked me to come along and speak on behalf of disco. And what's Charles Fox was the guy who, was it Charles Fox? Who'd been, the BBC man who'd done the radio ballads with you and McCall. Charles, I can't remember what his name was. He was adamant that disco was the greatest evil ever to hit British youth. So, we had debates like that. So I found the Communist Party, I wasn't a member, but I found that people in it sympathetic, and certainly when Marxism Today started, or the magazine became more kind of open to different views, I read for them a lot. Whereas Trotskyist parties I just found sectarianism impossible. You couldn't say, if you disagreed with something, you became a member of a group of people who disagreed, and therefore you were either expelled or you had to form a new party. I mean, it was kind of a nightmare. On the other hand, I take your point that when punk came along, those of us who were more kind of communist, who were members of the kind of, I can't remember what it was called, Music for Socialism, found punk, punk wasn't our natural element, it was kind of pub rock in a sense, came out of that. Whereas the Socialist Workers' Party was very quick and to see that you had to kind of intervene in what was happening to punk politics, and Rock Against Racism was clearly their initiative, although in Coventry where I live, the Rock Against Racism stuff was organised by another one of the Trotskyist groups. It wasn't just WP, it was somebody else, I can't remember. So I mean, I did kind of go to lots of meetings with all these different groups, but I was always on the Communist Party, all the libertarian, anarchist groups. Big Flame, that was the other one. Oh, Big Flame, yeah. Getting back to your career specifically, the Sociology of Rock was then republished in 1983 as Sound Effects.
What are kind of reformatted and republished, and what had changed in the intervening years? What was it?
Well, that was simply to do with publishers. Sociology of Rock was commissioned because a publisher in Britain, Constable, had a series on media. And the person who edited that series thought it would be good to have something on popular music, and I was approached. Once it was published, it was then sent to American publishers. And the American publisher was most interested in was a non-academic lefty publisher called Pantheon, which was successful at those days. And the editor there, who became a friend, really liked it, but said if they were going to publish in America a non-academic book, it had to be written so that people who weren't academics could actually enjoy it. And so I went systematically, you went through it and, would write down in the margin, incomprehensible rubbish. I put something like ownership of the means of production, so I had no idea what you're talking about. So that was rewritten, in a sense, to get a different audience, partly because it was American and partly because they wanted to try and get a much bigger audience of lay readers. But it gave me an opportunity to, to update it and do other things. The funny thing for me is, in retrospect, I actually think that I much prefer the original Sociology of Rock, because it was incredibly boringly sociological, so it was very defined in exactly what I was talking about sociologically and statistics and things. And Sound Effects is a better read, but it doesn't have quite that sort of, what I still think of I prefer, which is sort of academicism, which is what it was supposed to be.
I guess by the time Sound Effects comes out, you were a founding member of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, which is founded in 1981, and I guess in some ways has gone to strengthen insofar as it's grown. In retrospect, I guess this might be seen as the beginning of the institutionalisation of popular music studies, and I wondered if you had any reflections on that, on the role of the ASPM.
Yeah, yes, but it was interesting. I mean, in Britain, I slowly realised there were a small group of academics who were studying popular music who didn't come from sociology or youth studies, which is where I started, or human cultural studies, but interestingly tended to come from music departments where they'd had a big emphasis on studying American music, which meant that you studied black American music, which meant you studied jazz and blues and rhythm and blues. And the two key departments in Britain were York, under Wilfred Mellors, who was a professor, a big name in musicology, but whose interest was partly in secular American music, and Kiel, where a guy called Peter Dickinson was again, a distinguished composer, but also had set up an American Music Studies Centre. And the first proper popular music conference in Britain happened probably in 1979 or 80 in Kiel. And that's when people like Richard Middleton, who came out of York, David Horne, who was a librarian but was a specialist in American music, kind of the first time I met people like that, and other people who were involved in original popular music. And one of the key people there was a man called Philip Tagg, who was actually teaching in Sweden, who turned out, rather to my surprise, to have been the same boarding school that I was at, only because we were in a different house, we didn't really know each other. But he was the star music pupil when I was at school, he was the organ scholar. Now he had a whole different lot of links, because he was basically in the education department, which was with kind of lefty music educators in the Scandinavian countries and Holland. So when JASPM was set up, it was a funny mixture of academics from a number of different disciplines, but primarily interested in black music, and people who had a much more practical notion of that the real problem, what was happening in, and again, this probably has echoes in Finland, but particularly in countries where there were quite tight rules on what sort of music qualifications you had to have in order to be able to teach music teachers. And people found that they were getting pupils who really wanted to learn about popular music, who had teachers who had no interest in popular music and knew nothing about it. So in order to resolve this, you needed to get different sorts of people recruited to be teachers, but there were rules about who could be teachers. So there was a kind of radical push about making popular music studies an aspect of education, not just in universities, but all the way down. And a lot of those people were also involved one way or another in communist or communist-type parties across Europe. So the original JASPM was actually quite a political organisation designed to address policy, very much designed to be involved with musicians who were also music teachers, and which the academy was somewhat secondary. So the British representatives were a bit, were slightly different from the other ones, although lefty on the whole. So when it started, and certainly for the first and second, the conference that was first of all in Canada and then in Italy, it was still very much that sort of organisation. for me, this will make me sound very prejudiced, I think institutionalization started when the Americans took over. Because the American had a much bigger academic block, and a lot of them, and the American members were almost entirely academic musicologists who wanted to study popular music in fairly conventional musicological terms and had no interest in politics, really, and surprisingly little interest in black music, and certainly not much interest in issues of music policy or music education. And they slowly, as it developed, I think that model of the American Academic Studies Conference, where you go there because you have to meet somebody who might give you a job and all that stuff, that slowly became part of the institutionalization. So I think it did change. And I think the change was inevitable because once you get established as an academic subject, you become an academic subject, you can't fight that. But I think we've also lost, and I think we lost the attempt to bring other sorts of people in, which never really happened in the end.
So what do you think that have been IASPM and popular music studies successes, and what have been its failures?
I think its successes have been to enable a lot of people to do very interesting work on popular music within the academic environment. And I don't think that would have happened without having an institutional base. And certainly in the early days of conferences, I found them wonderful. They were very friendly. You could hear people talking about anything with great passion and enthusiasm. And you made friends, which I've still got from kind of around the world. It was just extraordinary. It was unlike other academic disciplines because it was so new and exciting. So I think just the number of people who were able to study popular music and I would regard the thing I've most enjoyed in my teaching career as having a lot of really interesting PhD students. And it's been, I needed that institutional base. To be able to get people to come and do PhDs in an old-fashioned music department in Edinburgh who have no music qualifications whatsoever, and yet still can get in and do a PhD because their work is interesting. I think that's the sort of thing that IASPM and popular music studies have done. They've given the kind of academic institutional base for that sort of work. I don't think popular music studies has really changed, has developed great theoretical ideas which didn't have. I mean, I still regard myself as a sociologist, not as a popular music studies scholar.
Yeah, sure. Another aspect of your career has been the fact that I guess you've been embraced to a certain extent by the music business, in as much as they trusted you with the Mercury Prize for 25 years. As for people from outside the UK not familiar, the Mercury Prize is an annual prize for the best album of the year. Has a great deal, I think, of critical credibility. So the debates that took place within the judges about how do you judge what's the best album of the year?
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to the beginning, the original idea for the Mercury Music Prize was that, which started in, I guess, 1993 or something like that, was a feeling. There was an interesting man in the British music industry who started the compilation series, which still goes, which I don't think ever came out here, called Now That's What I Call Music One. And every year, it was an anthology of all the best tracks of the year. And he was a very clever marketing man. And that was the problem about that album when he started was that all these different record companies didn't want to have their tracks mixed up with other labels. So he had to persuade them that this was a sensible marketing device. Because his notion was that a lot of people who would buy that album or kept it as present wouldn't actually have heard the singles, because singles are increasingly only being listened to by getting smaller numbers of the population who still listen to Radio 1 and who were young, essentially. And his view was, quite rightly, that you now had several generations of people who loved rock music, who'd grown up as teenagers in the 60s and listened to it ever since. But at a certain moment, when they finished university, or a job or a family or whatever it was, stopped following it. They just stopped reading NME, they didn't listen to radio programs. They knew what they liked, and if they saw there was a new Led Zeppelin album coming out, they got excited, and they were going to see Martin, they were going to see Rolling Stones every time they played anywhere. But if somebody new came along, the Kaiser Chiefs or the Arctic Monkeys, they would just sort of vaguely read about them, and they'd have no idea why they should bother to listen to them. So his feeling, he persuaded the rest of the record industry organisation, was that you needed to think of a way of marketing new music to old fans, is what I think of it. And the model they took was a book publishing prize in Britain, which was a Booker Prize, which was a way of kind of mass marketing literary novels, to put it crudely, to get people who wouldn't normally think I'd read a book like that, to see such a lot of publicity that it would be big in the bookshop, they would buy it, just to try it. So the record industry agreed that they needed a prize like that where all the record companies would enter all the albums they'd put out that year, and they would be short, the list of 10 would be selected, and you'll get so much publicity that people out there who were interested in music still would think, well, I might ought to try and listen to that. I've never heard of them, but this sounds like something good. Now, two things then happened. In order to pay for this and make it credible, they first of all needed to get a sponsor. Well, first of all, they needed to get somebody completely independent to run the prize, so it wasn't just seen as a record industry marketing. Although it was, they didn't want it to be seen as kind of crude, in the crude sense of marketing particular records. And that person was told, you know, we are not going to give you money to run this prize because we want to keep hands off. You've got to raise sponsorship to get the prize, which you did. And that's why it's called Mercury, because it was originally sponsored by Mercury Communications. And then they said, we need to have a judging panel that can be seen to be clearly independent of the industry. And I was suggested as someone to chair that for the reason that the record industry knew that I did understand the industry because of what I wrote about, but also I had absolutely no ties and never had to any record company whatsoever. I've never ever worked for one, managed to ban anything like that. So I was kind of squeaky clean from the point of view of scandal. So I was originally just supposed to do it for 1 year. And the people who were organising it realised actually the key skill I had, which had nothing to do with any of these things, was that I came from a university and therefore was used to going to committee meetings. And so it was actually quite a good chair of committee meetings. And the other people they've been thinking about, like journalists, are terrible chairs of committee meetings. Produced record company, radio presenters, I don't have any radio presenters here, but radio presenters are terrible because they never listen to what anybody else says. Because they're in charge of being able to say, this is going to be what we're going to play today, or whatever it is. So they were very bad at listening to other people's arguments. So my job really was to kind of coordinate the rest of the judges they had to be people who listened to a lot of music, because you get, you know, by the time I finished, you're getting something like 350 CDs that you have to listen to in about 6 weeks. And really, you could only expect people to do that if they were listening to a lot of music anyway. So there were music journalists or radio producers or TV producers, and they also had to have nothing to do with any of the industry or any of the records on the list. So it's quite difficult to get the right people. And so my job was to, so that was how that came about, and then I chaired it, and from the Mercury Prize, I seemed to do it, from that point of view, I seemed to do a reasonably good job in that the meetings happened and people didn't walk out and announce us to the press and say it was all fix or any of those sort of things. So, but within that, there was no pressure, particularly on us. In the abstract, there was no pressure from the record industry on us at all. And all that happened, just people were interested in how the process works. Everybody who was on the panel, there was usually about, it changed a bit, but at the beginning there were, say, 10 people on the panel. They all had to write in, send in a list of the 10 records they would have put on the shortlist. And in the office, they then coordinated that simply by adding things up. And then saying, right, we produced a long list of 30, these are the 30 tracks that seemed. And my job partly was to actually add some things that people might not have got there because of the numbers, that we needed to have some sorts of music that weren't there, because we were supposed to prize for all sorts of music, including classical. And then we would have a meeting, and I was very anti the idea of having votes. So we had a meeting where everybody had to speak. Every record that was out there, somebody had to agree they were going to champion it getting on the shortlist. And if anything, if nobody wanted to champion a record, we just cut it off. So I was more interested in enthusiasm of whether the record was any good or not. And then, I mean, it's difficult to describe this process, but people just presented where they thought the record should be on the list, and other people might disagree. And at the end of the day, you basically not exactly have a vote. It changed a bit. It's only when I first started doing it, I was desperate to avoid any sort of vote at all and hope it would just sort of come out, which it did to a surprising extent. And then you got that list of 10, and then you later, on the night of the show, you had another meeting, and then people had to argue why something should come off the list, and you got one left. And I enjoyed it very much, because some people are just amazing talkers about music. And I mean, the best single case for a record that I ever heard made from Mercury meeting was by your friend and my friend Mark Percival. He gave the best reason I've ever heard why a particular album by Mogwai should be on the shortlist. Everybody applauded him, and it wasn't on the shortlist. Although his argument was wonderfully persuasive, none of us could quite match it to what the record sounded like. So it was interesting. It was an interesting experience. And it changed over the years as sponsors changed and various pressures came on. But it basically worked like that. And the only thing I had, going back to the relationship with the industry, my job was my only real job was to keep the prize going. What mattered more than anything else is that the prize would still exist the following year. And to do that, you had to keep a lot of different sorts of people happy. And sometimes you had to have in the back of your mind that EMI hadn't had a record on the shortlist ever, and there was going to come a moment when they were going to not bother to enter anything. Although, interestingly, in fact, I think they went on never having a record ever, and the person who took over from me as chair, and in that period had been boss of EMI. And I asked about that, and he said, well, from his point of view, the prize was a good thing. It was really irrelevant that one of his records got on. It was encouraging people to listen to music. So I think a lot of people in the industry had a very sensible attitude to what it was for.
I mean, part of the reason I asked you about the prize was questions of judgment and value, which you address in your 1996 book, Performing Rites. I've probably got this wrong again, Simon, but I think one of the arguments you make in that book is that the processes of making value judgments are the same in the high and the low arts. And I wonder if you had any reflections about making value judgments in that.
I suppose, well, as a sociologist, I think making value judgments doesn't happen in the abstract, it happens in particular contexts. So any of you here, you just have to think of different musical places. If any of you are in a band and you're at a rehearsal, at some stage somebody's going to say that works, or that doesn't, or that's shit, you can't do that. Now that judgment only makes sense in the context of those 4 or 5 people in a band who have some sense of what they're trying to do in the band. And similarly, if you're a DJ, you can decide the record is complete crap because everybody leaves the floor when you put it on. Or if you're like the famous DJ, one of the Northern Soul DJs, you put the record everybody leaves the floor. This proves that this is a great record and not popular. So your value judgments can depend on what you're wanting to get. So there's not an abstract value, it depends on the context in which you're making the judgment. And I think that's true in classical music as well as, and I think it's true of all value judgments, they're not abstract. You can't ever, people used to say to me in Mercury, how can you compare a classical record and a pop record? How can you possibly compare whether Spice Girls is better than Mark Turnage? And I said, well, in everyday conversation, you don't. But in the Mercury Prize, that's what it's about. So you do. You've got no option. So you just, that's the context for making that sort of judgment. When you argue why you think, it had sort of vague criteria like, well, is it a record that reflects what was going on in music in that year? Does it do what it tried to do brilliantly? So you can see clearly that everything worked. Is it adventurous in some ways? Often it's quite simple things like, is there a kind of character or personality in that voice or in that music, that makes you stop to listen to it? So there are a number of different criteria which you can't measure against each other. And any different jury, any year, probably would have had a different shortlist. And even more interesting, I think any same jury who had done it either a week later or a week earlier would also probably have had a different shortlist. You just have to accept that this is how our tastes work. I mean, we don't all think the music we liked 10 years ago is still the best music we've ever listened to, or if we do, I think that's a bit sad. Because we've changed, the context in which we listen has changed. So I was always interested in that book. I was particularly interested in how one of the great pleasures of life for me, and I assume people still do it, is talking and arguing about music. And that's partly what we mean about liking music. If we really like a piece of music, we want other people we like to like it too, and get kind of irritated if they don't, or if we don't think they're listening to it properly or whatever. So there's some, so there's a kind of personal commitment to our values, which are partly what listening to music and enjoying music is about. And that's, that's true in all sorts of music. That's not just a popular music thing.
No, I very much agree with you there. And I think of all the arguments you have in your personal relationships about value of music, for example, and families and so on. In more recent years, I've had the pleasure of working with you on several projects around the live music industry. We've been involved in writing a history of the live music industry in the UK since the end of the Second World War. And I wondered if you could reflect on what you've learned through studying the live music industry after probably looking at the recorded industry more before.
I think anybody who's a real music fan, well, this is my value judgment, and anybody every time I've ever talked to anybody else or talked to students, if you ask, I used to ask first year students when they came in the first year, and nobody, I always used to say, write down on a piece of paper the best musical moment you've ever experienced. And with perhaps one exception, what was written down was always an experience of live music. either playing it or listening to it. It was never somebody saying, well, I listened to this record. And it kind of made me, and I've always felt that that meant kind of our sense of music and what makes music valuable is still somehow rooted in the live music. And if you talk to musicians, I mean, there are musicians who say I'd rather work in the studio than be on the stage for lots of reasons, but most musicians feel that what they do is about the magic of doing it live with, you know, in a group or whatever it is, and it working or doing what they wanted it to do or what they were hoping, what they were expecting, or something happened they didn't expect. So I always thought that live music was kind of more interesting as a kind of musical experience. But I also knew that I didn't know very much about the live music industry until I started working. So we started working on that project, and I'd done all my work really on the music business from the record industry point of view. And the second thing I very quickly learned is that the record industry, for marketing purposes, and this is very obvious in the Mercury, has a very clear sense that you've got to divide music up into different genres because that's how you sell them. So there are people who like metal, and there are people who like disco, and there are people who like this, and you've got to make sure you produce the music for that market and market it on the right radio stations in the right places. And I used to ask students, this, you couldn't do it once digital technology came along, but it was a really interesting exercise to say to people, think of your record collection and write down why you've got those records in it. And there'd be interesting things that would come out, like boys, and it was almost entirely boys, would always say, well, I like this person, therefore I need to have every record they've ever made. And then they were saying, it's really irritating, you get a girlfriend, she says she writes, somebody's only got 2 of their records, that's not writing. You know, so you have these sort of fetishized collecting of records. But on the other hand, you get a lot of people who say, well, I had that record because I was on holiday and it was the only one in the shop that I could bear to listen to. You know, I needed a record, so I bought it, or somebody gave, you know, my mother gave me that when I was 12, and I never really was into that, but it's always meant something to me. And people had all sorts of different reasons why they listen to music. And very few people just have one sort of music in their record collection. So I thought the record industry was giving us a kind of false notion of how music listening works. And once you start looking at live music, you realise that those sort of musical divisions are much more problematic in live music. Partly because most live music venues put on all sorts of music. And so there's a kind of overlap in people who are going for one reason or another. But partly because once you look at live musicians' careers, you suddenly realise that people actually don't know how to change what sort of music they play according to what jobs are available or what they can, you know, what jobs they can get or what they can do. And that's, you know, one of the things that's interesting in our first volume was the kind of overlap between classical musicians and military musicians and brass bands and these areas of music where people became skilled in particular instruments in quite different contexts, but then played across all of them. So I think for me, it was particularly interesting to think that focusing on genre is very problematic. And in the volume that we're just working on, the volume 2, which is really about, you know, the 60s and 70s, and when you start looking closely into things like punk, it's quite hard to distinguish punk from all the things around it, and what musicians did before and during and after. It's not really, there was a pure punk musician that only ever played punk, and it wouldn't make sense. And similarly, you know, that's one of the reasons why I love Spinal Tap, the film, because you see that band that keeps changing its image according to what's, you know, what television is, right? And there's a very nice Irish film that we saw recently where you see this kind of post-punk teenagers, and every time they see a new band on television, you have a picture of them going to school the next day, they've all completely changed their hairstyles and their musical tastes. And, you know, I think, you know, it's a joke about that, but on the other hand, it's kind of how we listen to music. Something new comes along and think, yeah, I really like that. And I think live music, you get a much better sense of how that musical change, both musical change and musical stability works. But, you know, I think you would probably agree that one of the things that's very fascinating is how much things haven't changed in some ways in the history of live music. You know, how much, you know, if you vanished or been Rick Van Winkle and fallen asleep in the middle 1950s and came back now and went around Glasgow and went to gigs, I don't think you'd find it completely surprising what you heard. I think the big change you'd probably find is it would sound louder, but even that might not be the case. I don't know.
I've got one final question and I'll open it up for people. One of the other things you've done in your career is do lots of interviews with people, some fairly well-known people. And I wondered if you could tell me who your favourite interview was and who your least favourite interviewee was.
My favourite interview by far was Brian Ferry, because he just was about I think Roxy Music had probably just finished for a working band for a while, and he was about to make his first album, which I can't remember which one, which had For Your Pleasure, one of those ones which had cover versions of lots of things. And I went to interview him in a flat in London, which I think actually belonged to his sister who was there. And he was sitting on the floor surrounded by singles and 78s, I mean singles and LPs, trying to work out which would be the best tracks for his album. And it was just like having a conversation with somebody who was friendly, had similar musical tastes. And I couldn't believe afterwards that this was the Brian Ferry I read about in all these interviews about what sort of precious sort of arty person he was. I did actually sometimes wonder whether it wasn't Brian Ferry at all. But he did look like Brian Ferry. So I really enjoyed that interview, and that largely was because it wasn't what I was expecting at all. It wasn't like a star interview. The worst interview is not necessarily the one I least enjoy, but the interview for me was the most unsatisfactory by far, was with Paul Weller of the Jam. Because I very much like the Jam anyway, but I thought he was a brilliant songwriter, as I still do. And I read some interviews and I thought he was actually interested in songwriting, and therefore I could talk to him. And I was actually in an unusual interview. I was doing it preparatory for the BBC because they were going to make a school music programme and they wanted to use Paul Weller to talk about songwriting, and as partly I was going to see whether he could say anything interesting about it. And it became very quickly obvious he had no interest in it whatsoever, at least not talking to me about it. And he was only interested in fashion, which I had no interest whatsoever. So we had this kind of cross-conversation where he would tell me where his shoes came from, and I didn't know the company he was talking about. And I was saying, how did you come to write Eton Rifles? And he'd say, well, so I thought it wasn't a bad interview. I mean, he wasn't unpleasant, he was perfectly nice, but he just wasn't interested in what I had to ask him. And I was not able to get at what did, and I still don't really know how he managed to write those songs, given how he was in that interview.
Well, I hope the people in the audience have been interested to know what you've had to say, because I'll now pass it over and see if anybody wants to ask any questions. I'm afraid I'll need to point as I don't know people's names, but please.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question about live music. Do you think, Simon, that in this age of neoliberalistic economics, that the decline of live music venues is irreversible? I think to back this up, I'd like to point out that I think it was a month or so ago, British rock magazine, either Uncut or Mojo, asked its readers to list 50 venues that had closed in the last 10 years, and the list was horrifically long.
There are a number of answers I could give to that. One is that I haven't, but Martin's been involved in a project in Britain that's just published its results, which is a live music census, which is a census of how much, what's happening to live music in Britain. So in sort of detail, he'll be able to answer that. My own view is that historically venues do close and have done for a very long time. If you go back to, if you've been asking this question in 1890, you would have said, I've just been reading this article in whatever the Publicans magazine was, and did you know that in the last year, virtually every small music hall was closed down because of the new fire regulations, which was true, they had. But then other things come to take their place. So I think my first question is, I don't really get a sense that there's less interest in people going to live music than there was. So I think there'll still be a demand for venues, and you often find, one of the interesting things about punk, which we've just been looking at, is that it was amazing how many small venues local punk bands were able to find when they'd been banned from the normal ones. My favourite example was in Derby, when the local punks actually booked every week and played the local Conservative club, who I don't think ever realised what was going on, but just needed the money. So I think, I think there's still venues. I agree with you. Second thing I would say is there's an incredible amount of nostalgia about venues that people went to when they were young. It's what in Britain is sometimes called the toilet circuit, because all can really remember is how terrible the toilets were. And again, I've been reading all these memoirs, and people say how wonderful this place was for going to see gigs. But then they describe what it's like, and you think, I wouldn't want to go there. Crawling in piss and everybody fighting all the time. This goes on in people's memories. So I think sometimes small clubs close down, and it's a good thing they do, because they can't really, sustain an audience. So I think in that sense, again, I think sometimes that list of venues that's closed is reflecting, quite rightly, people thinking that was a nice venue and it's gone. and they don't, and and they think the new venue doesn't have the character or doesn't have the soul or whatever. So I think, on the other hand, having said all that, I think there are good economic reasons why venue and legal reasons why venues are finding it very difficult. And I think in Martin's research there was some evidence that small venues struggle.
Yeah, it's a really complicated issue. I'm a kind of quasi-historian now, and I would say we'd have to look at this historically and think, what's a kind of natural turnover of venues?
Yeah.
The venues are a business like anything else. They come, they go. Are there particular problems at the moment? Possibly, but if you look over a 100-year period, possibly not. We don't know enough about why venues close, I think. That's the research that I personally want to do next. But
yeah, I think the other thing I would say, which I find, this is one of the things I found very interesting in our research, I've never really observed how important pubs are in British music culture. And that the pub, as the basic venue, has been the basic venue probably since the 19th century. But I was reading, I read about Sunderland, which after unemployment hit it in the 1970s, they said they still had something like 60 pubs.
But the pub is in decline as well.
Yeah.
Yes, well that's the problem. But the pub is in decline. But I live in a small town in Northumberland called Hexham, and when I first went there, I thought there wasn't very much music there. But then I realised this kind of peculiar. There's small places, the pubs that you didn't think have music do have music. We suddenly noticed walking past this rather dark doorway that it said folk club every week, and it seemed to be the RAF Benevolent Club was on the other why they're having folk club, and they have another night when you can go and listen to a classic album. So I think people find venues. I think one of the problems, which is probably what you're referring to, which I think is much more serious, is the kind of next stage up venue. I think that's really where the crisis is. I think you can always find small places to play where you're not expecting to make any money. But to find a venue that's big enough to enable the musicians to make a living out of playing there, I think that is a problem. But I think it's always been a problem.
Maybe a comment to continue from Dave's comment. I think it seems that festivals have kind of taken the primary place now. It doesn't even matter what bands are playing; it's just the event or the spectacle in Stadium Rock and so on. That stuff just continues to be a big draw. Do you have a comment on that?
I do, and I think that, it's interesting. I went to the Sibelius Museum up the road this afternoon, and I was very amused to see the big poster from the Turku. Well, I guess it wasn't the Turku. Yeah, partly because one of the bands playing was John Heisman's Colosseum, and I've just been reading the autobiography of Dick Hextall-Smith, who writes about that festival. And of course, European festivals in the early 70s were very important for British prog rock bands and British jazz rock bands. So I think festivals have a long, very important history, and they certainly solve a lot of promoters' problems. So I think, yes, I think festivals have, but of course festivals, they're kind of, for small bands particularly, they're a kind of one-off. Jazz bands probably, if you're big enough, you can probably make a living going around jazz festivals in Europe in the summer. And, there are other sort of specialists, say folk music festivals, where people obviously depend on for their living on being able to go from one folk festival to another. So yes, they're now absolutely necessary part of the music economy. They solve problems for bands that are big enough to get booked for festivals. The big problem there is how you get the build-up to be demanded by a festival in the first place.
Other question? Keegan, and then John.
You had the question to your students about what their favorite musical experience was.
Yeah.
What's yours?
Going to see Maze in the Hammersmith Odeon. Because Maze were a band I've never heard of, and I don't know if anybody here has heard of them. They were an American soul band led by Frankie Beverly, and I'd never realised that they were the absolute favourite band of the so-called Southern Soul Boys, which was London teenage boys and girls who went dancing every night. So I arrived at this gig just as a regular event to review, because I always liked soul music and I didn't know them, and I thought, well, I'll go and see them. And I just couldn't believe what the audience was like. It was completely packed out. The moment they came on stage, everyone was on their feet and danced all the way through, regardless of seats or anything else. And it was like Frankie Beverly and the band, obviously had been played London several times, and just kind of knew this audience. So it was like, how did this community build up completely without me, as I thought I was a good rock critic, knowing anything about it? And the music was wonderful, and the atmosphere was wonderful, and it was so entirely unexpected. So that still lives on as well. If I had to only go to one, if I was only allowed to ever remember one gig that all the rest would be wiped from my memory, that's the one I would keep.
John.
I do want to ask a question about a book which is right behind you there on the shelf, Art into Pop.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could place it in perspective now. For me, it was a real eye-opener as concerning the impact of the art schools on a whole generation of British musicians, but those art schools are closed down now. I went to a British art school back in the day and dropped out, but I was very aware that it was kind of a training ground, or there was an atmosphere of cross-arts creativity, which I don't think you can find to the same extent today. Is that something you should be nostalgic about?
I think you raise a very interesting question. I mean, it's my favourite book about Howard, partly because I didn't really write it. Howard Horne had read a PhD on the subject and you know, to get a publisher for it. And I was interested. I was fascinated by what he'd done and kind of added the historical context to it. I think somebody once said to me something that I found really interesting, which this was about Britain, which was that if you take the brightest young people growing up at a particular moment, they can choose any of the arts to get engaged in. But for a period in the 60s and 70s, music was the thing that most inspired them to do something arty. Book. And it's also very clear in the whole, in punk, particularly the significance of fashion and design and all those things that were part of that. But then later on, some said, well, subsequent generations, music was less significant for them. And other things became significant. So video, at one time, making videos or making filmmaking, and you would find that the kind of brightest boys and girls in an art school would gravitate towards projects that might involve music but weren't centrally music. And I think there's something to be said for that, which in other words, although I think art schools had problems once they had to start becoming like universities and some of their intake changed somewhat, I still think that they still are much more about creativity than, say, conservatories are, because of the sort of students and what they're trying to teach. But I think you're right, that I don't think music is central. You know, I think of a 17-year-old going to art school now, they're not going to think, I'm going because I want to be a musician. They're going because I want to be a graphic designer or a cartoonist, or to work on video games probably, or whatever it might be. So I think it's a very interesting question, because I can't answer why that change happened, but it does seem clear that if you look at what's happened to art schools, although there's still, you know, the art school dances in cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh are still sort of a significant place where the hip kids go and listen to hipper music and certainly wear much better clothes than everybody else. They're not really there because they want to become musicians, like say Brian Ferry did, or that generation.
I was just thinking Franz Ferdinand are probably the last sort of
yes, and I think
big art school connections certainly in Glasgow.
Yeah, I mean there are more than people realise now still, but I think the other thing about art schools was, and this may be one of the changes you're talking about, they used to be incredibly important as venues. I mean there's a whole different history which I would, if I had my life ever again, I find fascinating, is actually the significance of the school as a starting venue for all bands you've ever heard of. It's really interesting, and what, you know, how school music, how that sort of schools became a space for making music, sort of the school strongly disapproved of, and yet you can still do it. I think it's really, you know, it's very, and that's still certainly still true today. I mean, you can see that even if you look at people like the white grime artists and other black artists, they'll often say they started doing them, playing around and experimenting, and the school provided a space they could do that, and when they first met the people they still work with. So.
Any other questions?
Yeah, you say you've done quite a lot of study on record labels and how they interact with the industry and form the industry in a way. And with new digital tools, it's easy for any 16-year-old to make an entire album that sounds just as good as something produced in a professional studio in a matter of months, provided he has an ear for it, of course. What do you think the role of record labels will be in the future as musicians are more and more capable of producing and distributing their content en masse?
I think, again, I can't give you a definitive answer to this, but I would say from my experience so far, we probably misread what record industries did in the first place. I think their significance was always as publishers, rather than as sort of discoverers of music particularly. I think they often took the music on when it had already been shaped through the bands or the musicians' live experience and so on. And the key thing that they could do was that they could get the music heard by people. Now, when digital media and social media came along, obviously there were a lot of other ways of getting music heard by people. But publishers do something more than that. They kind of organise what you hear. And one of the experiences of Mercury that has been was very strong when we were doing it from 1993 through 25 years. We went through just the process you're talking about. On one hand, everybody says, well, the album's now dead. Well, in fact, we've got more and more albums released and people wanting to be on the, they've got shortlist and things. And it was certainly the case that we completely lost any influence at all on record buying. When we first started, if we put a list on a record on the shortlist, people would go into shops and they had to get hold of the music, listen to it, and you would see the sales go up. But once people would just instantly go onto Spotify and listen to the track and think, oh, I don't like that, and take it off. It had no effect on sales whatsoever. So clearly something had changed. But on the other hand, what changed from the point of view of judges was that we got an increasing number of records that hadn't been through record companies. And they were 95% terrible. And I suddenly started respecting record companies as the people who actually act as kind of quality control. Which is true. I think I proved, if you would go into a bookshop and you saw a bookshelf of books that had all been self-published, and then a book that would have been through various significant presses, I think you'd still probably trust the publisher better than I published and trust somebody who's self-published. So you need some sort of editorial help.
So
you can't just go out and listen to the web and say, I'm going to listen to 500 hours of music and I will find something I like. You need, and that's what Spotify has been a lot of what Spotify is about is actually not that, making lots of music available, it's organising that people hear the music that they want to hear, which I think is terrible myself, because I think people often listen to music they don't want to hear. But you can see that in other words, it's that editorial function that still matters, and that's why record companies still function. Now, if that goes, somebody else has got to do it. And I don't think we all want to just hope that randomly produced, downloading something. We've got to have some other indication as to why it's worth going to that effort to listen to it. Which maybe, which is again where live music comes in, of course. I mean, probably, certainly in certain genres now, I would imagine that more CDs are sold at concerts than they are in shops for certain sorts of genres. Because that's where you're getting your sense of whether you like this music or not.
I think we'll have one final question and then I think that will be it. Two final. Can you make them both quick? Thanks.
In the 60s, many working class bands made it to the big time, for want of a better expression, in the UK and elsewhere across the world. Do you think, though, that today it's much more difficult, especially in the UK and in Europe, for a band with a working class background to make it to the top, that preference is given to those who have had a privileged education?
I think it is, I wouldn't put it quite like you put it. I think the access to music making and being able to learn certain sorts of music skills is becoming more and more confined to people who go to sort of schools or have parents who can afford to pay for it. And I think that has a major effect on young people's ability to certainly go into those musics where those skills matter. And in general, I remember being asked after one Mercury, somebody, a smart journalist from the BBC, was able to say, did you know that 80% of the people who were on the Mercury shortlist this year went to public school? What do you say about that? Well, of course, I didn't know that. I didn't say anything very intelligent. But you could see exactly the point you're making. There are some counter things, because I think one of the things, and again, it's kind of under-researched by Popular Music Studies, although it will be part of Volume 3 when we get there. On the whole, most of the most successful young musicians in Britain over the last 10 years have been black. And they certainly have not, on the whole, and it's a big generation, but most of them, not even in the States terms, have they come from middle-class black families. They're often they're often second-generation African rather than Caribbean these days. And and their music making has been very much, as I said earlier, been involved in school, and with good teaching, but it's interesting, it often comes out of technology teaching rather than music teaching. I remember when Dizzy Rascal won the prize, he was very interested on how much he owed to a particular music teacher who had, in a sense, been able to bring into their classes working with recording and working with electronic instruments in a way which was quite unusual, but which had an effect on that generation of grime artists. So I think there are exceptions, which is interesting because they're not really studied why that's happening. But in general, I think you're right. But I think that there are places where you can see working class kids still coming through, and they have a very uneasy relationship with the record industry, has to be said.
Finally, from Kavi.
Yeah. Martin mentioned in the beginning that you might be the only popular music scholar translated into Finnish. Has any of your other books translated in any other languages?
Oh yes, I've got a row of books which are all completely incomprehensible. Yeah, and it's interesting to me. I mean, at the very beginning, when Sociology of Rock came out, that got translated quite quickly into German and Swedish and Spanish. And that was purely because it was an academic book on popular music and there were beginning to be people interested in that. Thereafter, it seems to be entirely random what gets translated. And it's been translated into virtually all European languages, including Hungarian and Russian. It's certainly been translated into Korean and Chinese, and various other things, which I certainly see something, or somebody tells me that's been translated. I have absolutely no idea how people pick the ones they pick or why they choose them. And, it must have something to do with what's being taught in a particular country. So yes, but I'm not unusual in this. It's popular music studies is quite international in that sense. I think the thing that's most interesting to me is that I will, possibly before I die, have a book of mine translated into French. There is somebody working on this now, but have been for a long time. The French have always been very reluctant to translate anything from me, particularly if it's academic. So that will be my proudest achievement when and if it happens.
Thank you, Simon. I'd like to end by thanking Kimmy for organising this, thanking you all for coming, but most of all thanking Simon Frith.
Thank you.